Hi, everybody. We are back and we are in chapter 23, Biosocial Development in Late Adulthood. All right, well, let's get started with the two main theories of why we age or how we age. The two theories differ in a couple of ways. The wear and tear theory says that our body wears out due to just the standard passage of time and the inevitable exposure to stressors that we all experience. So this model just assumes that aging's natural and there's nothing that can be done about it as far as avoiding the passage of time. Reduction of exposure to stressors might help to reduce the amount of wear and tear and might extend life. In this theory, the accumulation of free radicals, which I'll talk about in a second, which is chemicals that we accumulate as we are exposed to stress, that accumulation is what leads us to have basically a max age of 122. If a person manages to lead a relatively stress-free life and accumulates the minimum amount of free radicals, they could reach that maximum age of 122 under this model. The genetic clock model says that our DNA regulates the aging process. So each of us has, as we've discussed many times in this class, variations in our DNA. And our unique combination of DNA triggers different kinds of hormonal changes as we go through the life process. And these hormonal changes control cellular reproduction and repair. So some people have more efficient capabilities for reproducing their cells and repairing their cells than other people have. And so under this model, basically, if everything is perfect and everything's running exactly the way it should, we would have a maximum capability of reproducing our individual cells 60 times. And if you do the math on how long it takes for a cell to reach its full maturity, die off, and a new one to replace it, you end up with, oh wow, coincidentally, a max age of 122. So there are different explanations between the two theories, but the same basic conclusion, that the human lifespan maximum would be 122. All right, so let's break down those two theories a little bit more closely. So with the wear and tear model, we have this idea of cellular aging, that oxygen-free radicals, here's a picture, normal oxygen atom at the top, on the top left of this little picture. See how one of the electrons is flying out from the magnetism of the nucleus, and it becomes what's considered a free radical. It's wandering around looking for something to attach to. So unpaired electrons occur because of the energy process that goes on inside the nucleus. And when the electron from one cell or atom becomes free, it causes kind of a chain reaction, because then it bounces over to a neighboring cell, which causes it to release some of its electrons, and so on and so on. So what that means is that as these electrons are being unpaired from their nuclei, they are basically becoming waste products accumulating in the cells in a chain reaction where the existence of one free radical means that you're going to produce some more free radicals, which ultimately is going to erode the cell membrane and damage the body's cells. And that's really the big problem, is that these free radicals are going to damage your cell membranes, making your cells weaker and less likely to be able to reproduce themselves. Now, antioxidants can nullify the effects of free radicals by binding with the electron and getting rid of it. And so you can neutralize these free radicals by exposure to antioxidants. And so you've probably heard advertisements for different kinds of nutrients or supplements or foods that are high in antioxidants. And that's what they're talking about, is the idea that you have these things that you can consume that will bind to the free radicals and help to avoid the negative output of the free radicals. So in this model, given that we think that we know how to bind up some of the free radicals, you maybe could extend life through dietary changes and things like that. And of course, one of the factors that can cause the free radicals to occur is that you're under stress, or you're not getting enough sleep, or you're not doing other kinds of things that would help to give your cells time to repair themselves either. So a healthy lifestyle combined with healthy diet could help to reduce the effects of free radicals or reduce the occurrence of free radicals. Okay, what about the genetic clock? Sorry. The genetic clock says that we actually have a limited number of cell divisions that we can do. It's called the Hayflick limitation. The Hayflick limitation says that the telomeres on our chromosomes get shorter with each cell replication. So that means that each time your cell reproduces, it's going to lose ability to reproduce again. The telomeres are going to get shorter and shorter, which means that each cell has somewhere between 40 and 60 cell divisions that it can possibly make. Now, that's a pretty wide range. I mean, that's a 50% difference between 40 and 60. So one factor that the genetic clock takes into consideration is that some people's genes make it more likely that they'll be pushing the 60 cell divisions, and some people's genes make it more likely that they'll be the 40. Sometimes where our environment will help push us towards the 60 cell divisions maximum that our genes might be able to handle. Sometimes our environment might keep us down at the 40 cell divisions. One thing that we can do environmentally, the genetic clock argument says, is by calorie restriction. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about diets where you severely restrict calories. I'm not talking about going on a diet and losing a little weight. I'm talking about severe calorie restriction. And one hypothesis is that it slows aging. Now, I don't have any data to support that with humans, but I can show you data on mice. So, of course, mice mature a lot faster than we do, so their age is represented in months. And, a typical mouse, you can expect it to live 2 or 3 years. So 24 to 36 months is pretty typical for a mouse. But you'll notice that on the x-axis, we're seeing, a max number of like 55 months. So that's almost, that's a 4.5-year-old mouse, which is a really old mouse. So let's look at what's going on here with different colored bars. So the green bar is a mouse that just eats whatever the mouse feels like eating. So they're given a normal diet and they can eat at will. The blue one is mice that are kept on a 25% reduced rations. So they might want to eat more, but all they have is 25% less than what they would be normal free range amounts of food. The magenta one is rats that are or mice that are on the 55% calorie restriction. So they're eating a little bit less than half of a normal diet. And then in the red bar is the mice that are on 65% calorie restriction. So they're eating about 35% of what the rats in the mice, these are mice, in the green bar are eating. It kind of is interesting to see that there's not that much difference in the longevity of the mice who ate 55% calorie restriction versus 65%. And there's not that much difference between the eating normally and reducing it by 25%. The big jump is between 25% and 55%. So you really can see an addition of about 10 months. And in a mouse's lifespan, that's a lot of months. So a lot of people have looked at this data from mice and thought, well, humans should do that. And humans should eat roughly half of what they normally would eat, and that'll extend their lives. There's not a lot of data that really supports that idea, but it's kind of, I think, in the back of a lot of doctors' minds when they show us our BMIs and tell us that we would be healthier if we weighed less. I think there are a lot of times thinking about sort of calorie restriction idea, that being deprived of calories might actually extend life. Now this is a kind of dramatic jump between the theories of aging and then sort of how we react to aging. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about stereotypes and prejudice. So here we have this Dilbert cartoon where he says, "Asoc, this is Albert. He's old, but we need to call him mature. Explain to him what the computers are, but don't let him touch anything. The elderly like to fiddle." And then Albert goes, "I was a chip designer in my last job." And the boss goes, "Really? Chocolate or poker?" This is an assumption that a lot of people carry around, that if a person has gray hair or if they're over X number of years old, they don't know anything about technology. They probably never even turned on a computer. That's called stereotyping. A lot of times we carry around with us ageist attitudes. Ageism is where you carry attitudes about people simply based on their age. Now, this is the kind of stereotyping that we might expect to see for older people, right? Grumpy, sick, boring, disabled, arthritis, spiritual, constipated, asexual, bad drivers, depressed, forgetful, lonely, dementia. I'm not sure what the HOH stands for, frankly, but I'd like to point out that we have ageist attitudes on the other end of the age spectrum also. We assume that teenagers all carry certain characteristics. So ageism is something that we do towards lots of age groups, and a lot of times teenagers, they just were children, and so it somehow doesn't offend them quite as much when they are treated like teenagers, or we expect certain things out of them because they're teenagers. Whereas an older adult who now we just assume that they're boring because they have gray hair or wrinkles, or we assume that they wouldn't know anything about technology because of those things. They're like, wait a second, I was a chip designer. Why are you treating me like I don't know anything about this? It's kind of a different reaction that we have when we were in charge, competent, everybody knew that we were respected and respectable, versus when you're a teenager and you're sort of just starting to climb the ladder. So it's a lot less tolerable to older people, I think, to be treated this ageist way. Something that we see among, especially people who work with the elderly, is that they will engage in what's called elder speak. This table comes from a study of certified nursing assistants who work with the elderly in an assisted living situation, retirement home. And so they analyzed a bunch of video recordings of this certified nursing assistant working with a client and found some pretty consistent ways of speaking that are disrespectful of people and just because of their age. So for example, the collective pronoun substitution. How are we today? Right? Like, why would you say we? How are you would be what you'd normally say to a person. How are we today is a little demeaning. Diminutives, like inappropriate terms of endearment. Can you sign this for me, sweetie? Right? Why would you call an elderly person sweetie? It's demeaning. Childish terms. Are you feeling chilly willy this morning? Do you need your sweater? Tag questions. You're getting hungry, aren't you? Telling the person how they feel and then saying, aren't you? To get them to agree with it. Reflective forms. You washed yourself. No duh. Yes, I'm the one who washed me. Those reflective forms, right? They only found 13% of the time no evidence of elder speak of any sort in these video recordings that they observed. So it looks like a pretty common way that people who work with the elderly talk to the elderly. I teach a class on language acquisition, and it's a really in-depth 10-hour seminar on how children go from not speaking to fully capable of speaking. And one of the things that came up in the seminar, it comes up almost every time I teach it, is how the way that we talk to children is very similar to how we talk to older people. And as an older person starts to have difficulty with hearing, it becomes even more likely that we will talk to them like children. If we have to slow down in order for them to understand what we're saying, it oftentimes kicks us over into what we call motherese or child-directed speech, as our textbook calls it, where we talk about very specific things that are happening right here. We make assumptions about the other person so that we can simplify the communication. We basically use motherese on the elderly, and I think in large part because we assume that they can't really hear us, and we have to slow down, it kicks us into a higher pitch. We speak more slowly, and then we speak in sort of demeaning terms. And so I think that might be the source of elder speak. But one way or another, it infantilizes a full-fledged adult and makes it seem like they're incompetent to take care of themselves. The saddest part about stereotyping and prejudice is how often elders accept the stereotypes themselves. I mean, how often have you heard an older person say, oh my gosh, I'm getting so forgetful? I don't think I've ever met a more forgetful group of people than my early adolescent Girl Scouts were. I mean, those girls could not remember anything to save their lives, but did they ever say anything self-flagellatory about it? Did they ever say anything like, oh my gosh, I should have remembered that. My memory is really shot. They never say anything like that. They'd say, oh my gosh, I forgot. Whereas, my father, who was 50 years older than these girls in question, would say things like, oh my gosh, I can't remember that. Boy, my memory is really going. Oftentimes we accept these stereotypes and go, well, I guess it's just a normal part of aging. Or we get more self-critical than we should be because we think, wow, it feels like I used to remember things and now it seems like everything gets forgotten all the time. Or, as we get a little bit older and maybe start to realize, man, I couldn't run away if somebody tried to grab me in the street. They start to feel helpless or they feel like they're potential victims. And then they start to narrow their world because they're afraid that something's going to happen to them. So you can kind of see how elders change their behavior because they're accepting the stereotypes. So they might limit their opportunities. Maybe you have a person who has the means to take a trip, but they're like, I don't know. I mean, who would I go with? What if I forget to take my medicine? What if something happens to me? Things like that. And so they'll limit their opportunities. Actually, I'm pretty sure aging naturally and aging gracefully are mutually exclusive, right? Like, there's no way that you can be attractive while aging, right? I mean, these are the stereotypes that a lot of older people assume are true, and that causes them to go, well, I guess what's the point of even trying to look my best, and things like that. Stereotype threat is something that any of us at any age could experience. All of us belong to some group that is stereotyped against. We all do. I'm female, and the assumption is women can't parallel park. There's or women aren't good at math, or there's just all these stereotypes. And we all know what stereotypes are held about our groups. And so here's the thing, when we are placed into a stereotype relevant situation, so let's say, for example, I'm going to parallel park my car. And my stereotype gets activated, and I characterize myself. So I say, oh my gosh, I'm about to parallel park my car, and my husband's in the car, and I don't want him to see me mess up. I don't want him to think I'm like other women who can't parallel park. That's going to activate what we call stereotype threat, this fear that we're going to end up accidentally fulfilling the stereotype. So that gets us a little bit more wound up than we normally would be. If nobody else was in the car, I wouldn't even be thinking stereotype thoughts. But if I have an observer who might be, finding it funny that I'm fulfilling the stereotype, all of a sudden now I'm more anxious. All of a sudden I'm more self-aware. And so that actually takes some of my cognitive capacity, my physical capacity, away from the task. And so now all of a sudden, I actually perform worse than I would have if I hadn't had that audience. Because of stereotype threat, we actually end up harming our own ability to perform at our best. So if you imagine that an elder is accepting stereotypes about themselves, that, well, that wouldn't be safe for you to live there or go there or do that or have that job or whatever. If they're accepting that stereotype, but then saying to themselves, but I'm different, I should be able to do it. Their will to want to be different might be undermined by their cognitive awareness that other people think they can. And they may actually end up underperforming in their efforts to show other people that they can perform at the same level. So it's like this vicious cycle of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So stereotype threat may be one of the effects of older adults taking the stereotype seriously. All right, so stereotyping and aging. Now what's really nice these days is that more and more doctors have gotten interested in gerontology. Gerontology is the study of old age. And what they've found is that modern elders are staying fit and staying active longer. So modern elders are aware of the value of exercise. Modern elders are aware of the benefits of restricting alcohol consumption or quitting smoking even if they're older when they do it, and things like that. So gerontologists are finding that our modern elders are doing things that are really helpful for their longevity. Now, geriatrics is the medical specialty that's devoted to aging, to the aging process. One of the things that's really common is that all of us feel like people who are younger than us probably can't really be experts. If you're a younger person, you may have run into that people think, well, how could you know? You're like, what, 12? Even though you're a full-grown adult. Here we have a picture of an elderly patient on the left and her doctor on the right. And this elderly patient on the left would probably be less relaxed if she had a really young doctor. She'd be in her back of her mind thinking, how long have you been out of high school? Whereas she feels more comfortable with the older doctor. And that's one of the things that's kind of hard about the fact that our population is aging really rapidly, and there may not be enough experts who are older than the patients anymore. And so that's kind of a problem. A lot of younger people are interested in geriatrics and want to go into that specialty in medicine, and they run up against that brick wall of their patients not trusting them as fully as they should. All right. The last thing, I just want to get to a couple more things in this section, and then we'll take a break. So the demographic shift that we've been experiencing in the U.S., here we have in 2011, the population, it used to be called a pyramid, where you've got people by age. Here we are in 1971, so you can see the ages. See how it was more of a pyramid in 1971? And the blue bars show us the most populous age groups. So really the 15 to 19 year range was the most populous group in 1971. By 2011, we have the most populous group being the 60 to 64 year old. So it's a narrower range, right? And it's older. And you'll notice the 2011 chart is a lot straighter. Looks more like a rocket ship, whereas the 1971 looks more like a Christmas tree, right? It's wider at the base. So what we're finding is that we're getting this demographic shift, and the prediction is going forward in 2030, this is obviously a prediction, that the most common age group will be between 75 and 79, and look how all the bars really in the whole chart are predicted to be about the same width. So we're expecting more and more people who are older to be making up our population. Probably this demographic shift is coming because we're having fewer babies. The average, back in 1971, the average woman had 2.8 babies, which obviously means average was 3-ish, sometimes 2, and sometimes a lot more. By 2030, they're expecting, right now, in fact, the average woman has 1.3 children. The average American woman has 1.3 children. So we're having fewer babies, and more people are making it through middle adulthood. If we look back at this chart, you'll see in 1971, the biggest drop-off was between, the 45 to 49 bar and then the 60 to 64 bar. We were losing a lot of people during midlife, whereas today, we're not losing as many people during midlife. So what we're ending up with is more of a rectangular distribution. We're living long. Those of us who get born are living longer. So, all right. So what we're finding is that the fastest growing group of people would be what we call the centenarians, who make it to 100. So the last thing I wanted to say in this segment is what we consider old, what we call older, and what we call the oldest people. Old would be what we call people who are between 60 and 75. Oftentimes they're in the young old category because they're still healthy and vigorous. They're involved in their family. They're involved in their community. This makes up about 70% of elders in the U.S. Between 60 and 75, healthy, vigorous, involved people. The old would be people between 75 and 85 usually. And these are people who are starting to show some deficits, either health-wise, mental deficits, social deficits where they're starting to withdraw or losing their community. And this makes up about 20% of the population of people over 60. And then we have the oldest old. This makes up about 10%, and this is going to be people over the age of 85. And we're going to call them the oldest old, not just because they're over 85. They may not be 85 and they fall into this category. They may be over 85 and not fall into this category yet. But these are people who are dependent on others for, they may be in a nursing home, or they are hospitalized because they keep having recurring issues, things like that. So when we talk about elders, there's still these developmental breakdowns within this big age group, where we could say that some people are functioning like just regular adults, and some people are functioning like people who are starting on their decline. All right, well, let's go ahead and stop here, and we'll come back in the next segment. We'll talk about different types of aging.